in Ethiopia. All of them happen to be funded by the World Bank. There are no active projects now funded by the African Development Bank. And you'll actually get to take a look and see the degree to which gender is quote-unquote mainstreamed or integrated into these investments. Thanks. For example, and I'm going to use my little black and white copy here. The largest investment at this point is the World Bank's Agriculture Growth Project. It's worth $282.1 million. It was launched in 2010. It's supposed to go through 2015. Unsurprisingly, for those of you who know the IFI's track record, this project does not look at gender rights issues or human rights issues. Pretty much any time the World Bank or any of the IFIs address gender issues, it's always because of an economic argument, not because of a human rights argument. It also says a lot about gender inequality, as many IFI projects do in their appraisal documents, but it doesn't really say very much about what they're doing to address those inequalities. For example, this appraisal for the Agricultural Growth Project says there's a considerable, quote, there is a considerable gender imbalance. Women are less educated, they're not equally involved in decision making, and tend to benefit less from the overall development process, and it goes on and on. So the project says it will enhance opportunities of women to access and manage natural resources and finance and to participate more fully in social organizations and decision making, but then there are no indicators to measure that. So it's just an example of how they could have this fantastic language and they could say, well, there are all these inequalities that we acknowledge and this is how we plan to respond to it. When you look at gender data, though, are they using any gender disaggregated indicators? There are none. There's actually no way that the project is measuring the degree to which women get involved and women are able to participate. The project gives very limited context in which to understand gender relations in regard to agriculture. In terms of women's access to the project benefits, it says that women and young people will be encouraged to participate and says women and youth, women and youth, women and youth. I'm convinced someone almost cut and pasted this phrase and just sort of peppered it throughout the appraisal document. It's repeated a number of times, and yet there's no plan to actively promote women's participation or the participation of youth. There's no indication that women, girls, or any other marginalized communities actually participated in the project design. The output, when you look at what we call gender output, it says the project will assist small and medium-scale farmers. We know that women are predominantly subsistence farmers or small-scale farmers. It says they'll help them, but it also aims to help large commercial farms, farmer organizations, traders, and agro-processors. We know that these fields are dominated by men. So, and finally, the project does not look at the differential impacts of the project on women and girls. So I know I only have a few minutes left, but you'll see you'll see a similar pattern throughout the other projects that are highlighted in this case study. So I hope that just gives you a sense of what we're focusing on. This is a major problem with the IFIs in that they acknowledge that gender equality is essential for development, but when it actually comes to integrating gender in a meaningful way, they really fall short. I would also, just to underscore that, this is also mentioned in our primer. Following the 2010 report from the Independent Evaluation Group, the World Bank did come up with a fantastic guide for integrating gender in agriculture. I couldn't have written it better myself. It's fantastic. The problem is, it's not mandatory. So, I encourage you to take a look at this. There are plenty of materials available on the World Bank website if you just want to look at this as a reference point. But there's a major disconnect between what the Independent Evaluation Group recommends and all these wonderful guidelines that they publish and what actually happens in World Bank investments. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks so very much, Elizabeth. And I think one major shortcoming that is going through any investment that the IFIs are doing, be it in development, be it also in climate finance, with respect to integrating gender, is actually the lack of monitoring and evaluation. This was also a very big issue brought up in the Independent Evaluation Group report, namely the lack of really a framework for how to evaluate within the organization and the World Bank, and I'm assuming it's similar with the other multilateral development bank, how staff is trying, how management is trying to basically mandate gender considerations and gender knowledge within the staff and provide the incentive structures that staff is actually trying to not just sprinkle in the gender language, as Elizabeth has pointed out, but actually do the gender analysis and then follow the gender analysis up with the gender indicators, but also with the gendered budget, and also do the gender budget accounting for the projects. So please.
Zaamu was going to speak next.
Thank you so much for
coming.
Thank you so much for coming, and there is nothing that we can do and can move out and be productive if it doesn't involve women, and that is one of the problems which the institutions that look at gender, at agriculture, at ways and means of production have been missing out. They leave out women. In Uganda, for example, women are the ones who are heavily involved in agriculture. Small plantations, not the large commercial ones which you see all over the world. But Uganda's economy heavily relies on agriculture. And women constitute the highest number in the workplace, which means whatever method, whatever mechanism, whatever program that is put in place and doesn't involve women leaves out the biggest number of people who affect the economy. The climate change comes in with its own ways of derailing any other processes, and the woman is on the sideline. When you look at climate change negotiations or talks or meetings, women are not there, and yet they are supposed to continue with agriculture. And climate change is affecting agriculture because of the increase in the temperatures. There are many studies have indicated that if this rate continues, we may no longer produce coffee. Coffee has been one of the main incomes for Uganda. So what is the way forward? We have to look at food security and ensure that when we are looking at programs that are mitigating and adapting to climate change issues, the woman is on the forefront. How can we do this? Maybe we have to look at the short-term food production, because we are targeting the long term and forgetting about the short term. They take a short period to grow. They can be processed and stored, but then the institutions are not looking at post-harvest. There is so much wastage of food. If the institutions could look at post-harvest mechanisms and promote women's initiatives in agricultural production, that could help women to look at food security and find ways of moving on in the wake of climate change. Uganda produces very many tons of bananas, but they are not exported. We are the second largest producers of bananas in the world. It is only of recent that bananas have started finding their way into the US. Because they were not being processed, they couldn't export that bulk, and the price wouldn't fetch the same. Uganda, being a landlocked country, faces other problems which affect women. Transportation. Even when they produce, they can't transport. They need cold storage, which is not available. The bananas here in the US are packed and vacuum sealed. I think 18 kilograms go for $100. That is some money which can really push a woman to being secure. But then we have to look at the chain. The producer, the transporter, the seller, does that money go back to the grassroots? It doesn't. And the other thing the institutions have to look at is in promoting intellectual property rights, because Ethiopia went into that program of licensing and branding. Within a year, they had made a profit of $100 million. But there's a long chain, right from the grassroots, the cooperatives, the unions, and the international market. The profit that comes out can push back to the agriculture sector being on a level which is productive and sustainable. But we are not looking at intellectual property rights in Africa. The Californian and the orange here in Florida, we say it is the Florida orange because of intellectual property. And you go and buy it at a price which is manageable and sustains everybody. But in Uganda, we are not looking at intellectual property at that level yet. So the institutions should look at promoting intellectual property rights so that the income that comes out can sustain agriculture and go to programs which can mitigate and be adapted to climate change issues as well. For example, forests in Uganda are disappearing at a very, very high rate. But even if people plant forests, they won't be enough because climate change is a global issue and we need the balance. If the balance is not coming from other institutions, then however much trees you plant will not have the effect in other areas, because this is an issue which requires concerted efforts. You can't fight climate change on your own. And if the institutions don't come in and meet their obligations, then it becomes very difficult to ensure that agriculture will be an activity for women. And Uganda as a whole, many developing countries depend on agriculture. And yet you will not find financing for women to process, to employ other people, to get equipment. Can we look at issues that start with grassroots and empower women in a very responsible and respected way? I also look at Rwanda and see the way they have moved. This is a country which had gone to nothing, but they started their empowerment drive from the grassroots to cooperatives, to the international community coming in and putting in money. Of course, the money they put in cannot be said it was too much or too little. If the cooperatives were not working, if the women were not putting in, if government policy were not working, there wouldn't be any empowerment. And that is where we can start from the Rwanda example, really. From nothing to something. And these are concerted efforts. The institutions, the government, the women, the skills all over the world put in their skills. So it enhanced the program of empowerment. We can move together and look at what we can do from the grassroots level, and then move on to the government. The government of Uganda is pro-women, and the government wants to industrialize the country. Now that we have oil, that is another problem which is going to affect food security. Many